When we think about warfare from the past, our minds usually jump to chaos, right? Just pure, bloody chaos. But what if it wasn't chaos at all? What if, underneath all the noise and fury, war was actually a system? A brutal machine, for sure, but a machine with rules, with logic, and with outcomes you could actually predict.
So let's really dig into that. When you picture armies clashing hundreds of years ago, it's so easy to see it as just a total lottery, a storm of random, unpredictable events where luck decided everything. But was it really just chance? Was that all there was to it?
Or, and this is the big idea for today, could it be that war operated more like a complex piece of machinery? A system with very specific inputs, clear mechanics, and logical outputs that, if we look closely enough, we can actually reverse engineer and understand. That's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to pop the hood on this war machine.
So here's our game plan. First up, we're going to look at ignition, what actually gets this machine started. Then we'll dive into the engine itself, the nuts and bolts of how conflict really worked. And finally, we'll analyze the output, how this machine became one of the most powerful forces for change in the world.
All right, let's get into it. Part 1, ignition. What were the reliable, predictable pressures that just kept pushing pre-modern societies towards war, time and time again?
Well, one of the biggest triggers is something called the Malthusian trap. It's a really simple but powerful idea. A society's population will almost always grow faster than its ability to produce food. And when that happens, you inevitably hit a crisis point. There's just not enough to go around.
And that gives us our first big rule. If a state's population starts to outgrow its resources, its farmland, its water supply, then the probability of that state launching a war of expansion goes through the roof. War becomes this brutal, but in a way, logical solution to go and take the resources you need from someone weaker.
But pressure for war doesn't just come from the bottom up because of hunger. Oh no, it also comes from the top down because of ambition. This brings us to the idea of elite overproduction. Basically, it's what happens when your society is churning out way more qualified, ambitious elites than there are high-status jobs for them to fill.
And this leads to our next rule. If a state has a serious case of elite overproduction, then you've got this whole class of frustrated, angry elites who are highly motivated to push for a war. For them, a war isn't some disaster. It's an opportunity. It's a chance to create new lands to rule, new titles to hold, and new powerful positions for themselves.
Okay, our third major trigger is all about friction at the borders. Think about it. If two rival powers are fighting for control over the same valuable trade routes, conflict is pretty much baked into the cake. And in the same way, if you have a settled farming society right next to a mobile, nomadic one, well, you've just created a permanent flashpoint that can ignite at any moment.
And this frontier conflict had a really interesting rhythm to it. When a kingdom was strong and stable, its farmers would push out into traditional nomadic lands. But when that same kingdom got weak or fell into chaos, you could bet that nomadic raiders would come sweeping in. It's this constant ebb and flow that the great historian Ibn Khaldun wrote about centuries ago, a powerful, cyclical engine of war.
Okay, so we've covered the sparks. Let's move to part 2, the engine. Once a war actually starts, what are the fundamental rules and constraints that dictate how it's fought?
The single most important rule, the one rule to rule them all in pre-modern war, was logistics. It's not sexy, but it's everything. An army marches on its stomach. So the rule is dead simple. If an army gets too far ahead of its supply wagons, then you can practically guarantee it will start losing soldiers every single day to starvation and desertion. That was the Iron Law.
So what do you do when the supplies run out? Well, the army can try to live off the land, which is a nice way of saying they steal food from the local population. And this always leads to a predictable disaster. If an army starts foraging, then it completely shatters the local community, turns the people into enemies, and very often sparks a nasty insurgency that can bleed an army dry.
Rulers also had a really tough choice to make about who was going to do the fighting. You could go with peasant levies. They were cheap and you could get a lot of them, but they were unskilled and crucially, they had to go home for planting and harvesting season. The other option, professional soldiers. These guys were pros, highly skilled, available 24/7, but they were so expensive that a long war could literally bankrupt your entire kingdom.
Technology on the battlefield often worked like a giant deadly game of rock, paper, scissors. There wasn't one single best weapon. Take the heavy cavalry charge, the pre-modern equivalent of a tank assault. It was terrifying, but it could be stopped dead in its tracks by a disciplined square of infantry holding long pikes.
Rock smashes scissors, paper covers rock.
But then a truly disruptive technology came along that just flipped the whole table over: gunpowder. If an army showed up with powerful siege cannons and early firearms, then the old rules just didn't apply anymore. Cannons could obliterate fortress walls that had been invincible for centuries. It created this huge psychological shock and forced every single army to either adapt or die.
Okay, on to our final part. We've seen how the machine starts and how it runs. Now for the big question: what does this machine actually produce? What are the profound, lasting changes that war leaves in its wake? And here's the biggest paradox of all. As horrific and destructive as war is, it was also the single most important engine of state building. I mean, the powerful, centralized nations that eventually came to dominate the world, they were all forged in the fires of constant war. There's a name for this process: the ratchet effect. It works kind of like this. Step 1. You're under constant threat from your neighbors. Step 2. That forces you to raise a permanent army. Step 3. To pay for that army, you have to create brand new, efficient taxes. Step 4. To collect those taxes, you have to build a whole government bureaucracy. The result? State power ratchets up, and it almost never goes back down.
War was also a massive driver of innovation, but usually out of pure desperation. So here's the rule. If two armies are locked in a miserable, grinding stalemate where nobody can win, then the pressure to invent or adopt some kind of game-changing technology becomes absolutely immense. Necessity really is the mother of invention, especially in a trench.
The effects weren't just political or technological either. They were deeply social. Think about it. If a state needs to mobilize its entire population to fight a huge war, then, after the war is over, those very same people, the farmers and workers who sacrificed everything, are way more likely to turn around and demand a say in how they're governed.
But the output of the machine could also be total, catastrophic failure. If a state loses a war in a really disastrous way, it can set off a fatal chain reaction. You get a financial crisis from the war debt, the people lose all faith in their leaders, and sometimes the whole state just collapses.
So, when you put it all together, you can see that pre-modern war wasn't just mindless chaos. It was a system. A brutal machine, yes, that ran on a fuel of resources, people, and ambition. And what it produced, for better or worse, was the world we now live in. Powerful nations, transformative technologies, and completely new kinds of societies.
This machine built the world of the past, no doubt. But that leaves us with one last big question to think about. When you look at our world today, have the fundamental rules of this machine, the pressures of resources, the ambitions of elites, and the disruptive power of new technology, have any of those really changed at all?